This afternoon there was something of a historic meeting in the State House where two former governors named Dukakis and Weld met with the current governor to discuss serious congestion in our two major rail stations and what to do about it. And Bill and I happen to be very strong supporters of connecting the two stations rather than spending money to expand the two of them, which will really do nothing. And we wanted to have a discussion with the current governor. He was dressed in a suit and tie, Bob. Bill Well was dressed in a suit and tie, and I came the way I am. And said to Charlie Baker, Charlie, when you're an ex-governor, you can dress any way you damn please. Especially on a day like today. Can you imagine wearing that piece of cloth around your neck, Robert? I mean, it's just... Anyway, it's great to be with all of you, to see so many of you here, and to be joined by my dear wife, who has just gone through 5 weeks of hellish vertigo. I don't know how many of you have had this condition. It's brutal. It's brutal. Not only that, but she was given some medication that got her to the point where she couldn't recognize her husband, which was a little unsettling, to put it mildly, and thought her dad was still around. I mean, I'm serious. So you gotta, anyway, I'm happy to say that she has been emerging slowly but surely from this condition, and if all goes well, we're gonna miss your birthday, I'm sorry to say, because we're going to a Greek youth event in New York, and these days, Greeks everywhere need lots of encouragement, lots of... In fact, I want you to know, I don't want to digress, but I want you to know that a group of us Greek Americans working with the White House to see if, following this next Greek snap election, we can put together a U.S. stimulus program for the Greek economy out of existing programs, at least in your half Greek, for heaven's sake, right? See if we can give them a boost in terms of morale and end this foolishness where we're going to try to cure 26% unemployment with austerity, which is absolutely crazy. So I'm the old guy here. How many of you were politically conscious in the 50s? Don't be embarrassed. But a handful. Well, my role is to kind of set the stage for the 60s by telling you about the 50s. And, you know, it's interesting. We often romanticize the past, folks, and never more when it comes to describing the 1950s. It was the golden age, you know, the greatest generation, and so on and so forth. I mean no disrespect to the folks that defended and fought for us in World War II, or some of the things that were happening during the 50s. Well, let me tell you, the 50s was not one of our great decades. And let me give you a sense of that from my perspective. Okay, so Kitty and I were at Brookline High School in the 1950s. I graduated in 51, she graduated in 54. I went to Swarthmore, she went to Penn State. Totally unconnected at the time. In fact, my high school girlfriend, years later, introduced us, literally, and is a dear friend. But Kitty claims, I don't know whether I've mentioned this to some of you, but Kitty claims that she was a freshman, I was a senior. She handed me a cup of water on Beacon Street when I ran the Boston Marathon in 1951. And that's entirely possible because I was dying of thirst at the time. Did you run the marathon, Jack? Never ran it. He was a speed guy. It was a record field, 300. And I and my buddy, Reed Wiseman, who was the only student Kitty or I knew at Brookline High School who was the product of a mixed marriage. And I'm not talking about interracial, I'm talking about Christian-Jewish. He was the only student we knew. It was a product of that. Brookline High School was divided religiously like a knife. The Jewish kids, the Irish Catholic kids. There was little or no dating between or among them. And a small handful of us, I was one of them, who seemed to move fairly easily back and forth between both groups. Kitty was another. But it wasn't until she was 17 that she learned for the first time that her biological grandfather was Irish. So I've always assumed that that had something to do with the fact that she was one of these, Boston was divided racially and religiously. People of color, folks, could not live in the town of Brooklyn. I'm not kidding you. Unless they were African American, with one exception, they were janitors. We had 2 African American families who lived in Brookline because they were janitors. They lived in the basement. And Roland Hayes, the great, great African American singer, who, through an interesting collection of circumstances, was able to purchase a house on Pill Hill, and whose daughter was my high school classmate, Afrika. But that was it. In fact, people of color couldn't live on this side of the railroad tracks. They could work over here, they had to go back over there. Serious. In Boston. I paid my first visit to the Fernald School for the Retarded, as it was called, one of 5 state institutions for kids with severe developmental disabilities. This was in the 60s, although these conditions, obviously. And in point of fact, in the 50s, there were 23,000 people who were institutionalized in state mental hospitals. Hundreds of them at Boston State Hospital on Morton Street in Mattapan. And I was invited as a young legislator, in the early 60s, to visit the Fernald School. For some reason, Kitty wasn't able to do it, so I went with my mother-in-law, who had worked in an institution of this kind in Weimar, Germany in the 20s, at Spandau. There was this institution at Spandau. And it was all over. She turned to me as we left and she said, Michael, I never saw anything this bad in Weimar, Germany in the 20s. It was unbelievable, folks. We walked into a place called Labor's Hall, which presumably had some work done on it, to see 75 severely disabled boys, half of them naked, sitting in their own excrement on a concrete floor with 2 staff people. That's the way we treated these kids. In Massachusetts, in the 60s, Barry, it was worse than the 50s. I spent the fall semester of my senior year at Swarthmore in Washington on something called the Washington Semester Program at American University. Washington, D.C. in 1954 was as segregated as Johannesburg, South Africa. With one exception, African Americans finally were permitted to sit anywhere they wanted in the buses in our nation's capital, but that was it, folks. Schools were segregated by act of Congress. Restaurants were segregated. Places of public accommodation were separated. In our capital city, while we were running around the world telling people to join us, because we were the leader of what we called the free world. And a fellow named Joseph R. McCarthy from Appleton, Wisconsin, had been elected to the United States Senate and was absolutely terrorizing the country, destroying reputations of people who were loyal, patriotic Americans. Phrases like pinko, fellow traveler, commie sympathizer, with a rage. Congress passed a bill creating a subversive activities control board that had the authority to hold hearings to determine whether or not organizations who were acting in a perfectly constitutional way should be designated as subversive and therefore subject to all kinds of sanctions and penalties. That was the 50s. So when somebody starts telling you about the golden age of the 50s and how wonderful it was, well, maybe it was for some people. but it wasn't for a lot of others.
March 4th, 1933. We used to inaugurate presidents on March 4th. And realizes, following Hoover and realizing the desperate straits of the country, that he has to move quickly. And so those first 100 days are historical. JFK did the same thing. He realized, right after you get elected, right after you get nominated, that's when you have the most power. And of course, as you saw, as I rolled through the text, that is exactly what Johnson did within 2 months after he takes office. Barack has never had the chance to do that. And so 7 years into his presidency, there is not that same record. Now, he doesn't face, Roosevelt by 1936 has an all-Democratic Congress. Kennedy had that. Johnson had that. But this idea of hitting the ground running across a whole range of stuff, immigration, civil rights, the economy, is what made those two presidents so phenomenally successful.
And yet Kennedy had his problems, folks, with Congress.
Yeah.
He campaigned hard on Medicare. Remember, Truman had tried to get universal health care year after year after year. Couldn't do it with allegedly Democratic Congresses. Of course, a big chunk of those Democratic Congresses were Southern Democrats who were racist and conservative. And finally, Harry Truman, after he got elected in 48, tried again, said, okay, how about doing it just for folks 65 and older? Nothing doing. American Medical Association was just as adamant. JFK campaigns on a big rally, Madison Square Garden, thousands of seniors. Can't get the thing on the floor of the House because Southern Democrats are controlling the Rules Committee. Finally gets it over to the Senate, and it's defeated by a Democratic Congress. Think about it. So it wasn't until his assassination, Johnson comes in, and then Johnson with this kind of legendary ability to get things through. And even Johnson was stymied. And there was a fellow named Wilbur Mills. Remember him? Arkansas, Harvard Law School. Small-town Arkansas, Harvard Law School. Who was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, right? And Mills, as we all know, unfortunately had a problem. It was alcohol. And had himself a girlfriend who was, I forget what her real name was, Argentina, but it's Fanny Fox. And they were discovered one night
The reflecting pool.
swimming in the tidal, or whatever they were doing, in the tidal basin. And he actually came up here and watched her at one of the burlesque houses on Lower Washington Street. I mean, came from Washington. It was really, you think it's a little wacky these days? I mean, but it wasn't until finally Johnson and Mills got together. Mills was doing something for seniors. Kerr Mills was kind of the predecessor to Medicaid, but only for seniors, and means tested. And finally, Johnson just kept working and working and working, and all of a sudden one day they announced a compromise. Johnson gets Medicare for people 65 and older, and Mills gets Medicaid for poor folks and folks on public assistance. And we get Medicare and Medicaid all of a sudden together. But that didn't happen under JFK. Imagine, couldn't even get a floor vote because there was a guy named Howard Smith, who was about 99 from Virginia, who was the chairman of the Rules Committee. And it was Tip who took on Smith and finally got the Rules Committee reorganized and expanded so that some of the more progressive Democrats could begin to get some legislation through. But no question there was this sense, we got to move, we got to move, we got to move. But don't assume that it was like getting a knife through butter. And even, I hate to go on at great length, lots of memories here. One of the first Democratic state conventions I attended was the one in 1952. It was out in Worcester or someplace. Paul Devil was the hero. Any of you remembered? Anybody here remembers Devil? Anyway. And I remember these rather plump, older, mostly Irish ladies, when Kennedy got up with that accent saying, "Get that Harvard boy out of there. We want Devil." I'm serious. Kennedy was a congressman. He was running against Henry Carter. I'll never forget. Get that Harvard boy out of there. Where's Paul? You know, they wanted Dever. So don't assume it was peaches and cream around here. You know, I mean.
Phenomenal. Question over here.
We could debate for a long time whether...
Who are you, first of all?
I'm Frosty Beerglass from Mission Hill, and I'm a proud alumnus of the School of Law, Northeastern Law School. Anybody, any other Northeastern law people here?
There we go.
We could debate endlessly about whether FDR was great because the times compelled him to be great, and whether Kennedy was great because he was a great leader, whether he made the times. But my question is this. Kennedy and his team learned to govern. Now, were they successful because they learned to govern, or did they govern because they were great leaders?
Ooh.
I don't know where to begin with that. You're the law school graduate, Governor.
Big deal. Although, the only time I saw Kennedy in action up close was at the law school across the river. He was a member of the Harvard Corporation. And he had been to a meeting of the Harvard Corporation and came over to talk to the law school Democrats. About 400 of us there. And he said, I've just come from a meeting at the Harvard Corporation. The only two Democrats in the place, he said, were me and Joe Clark. Who was Joe Clark?
Pennsylvania.
Former mayor of Philadelphia and United States Senator. And he said, we stood in a corner together, talking to each other. Never forget that. Then he came over, he said, I'm not going to make a speech, I'm here for about an hour and 15 minutes, just fire away. And it was one of the really most remarkable sessions I'd ever seen with a politician. A little nervous. Hands kept going in and out of his pockets, which was a little distracting. But no fuss, no muss, straight on. I mean, answers to, and this was a pretty tough audience.
And he was 43 years old.
Well, at that time he was 40.
40.
Yeah. It was so impressive.
Yeah.
It was so impressive.
I don't know if this is the answer to the question, but the one thing I would say about both FDR and JFK, that I have children in their 20s, so it struck me that they had no awareness that a president could have been a war hero. You know, I was talking about the fact that we have the coconut in the museum excitedly when I first took the job, and my son, who was a government major in college, grew up in Massachusetts, appreciating politics and government with two parents who lived for it. And he looked at me and he said, well, that's just PR, right? And I said to him, no, actually, President Kennedy was a war hero. He won a Purple Heart. He saved lives. This was true of FDR, who had suffered greatly with his polio, that these were men who came to this office with a lot of life experience and having been really tested and lived through a lot. So I can't help but think that that played into their ability to be great leaders, because they had to each, in their own ways, overcome so much. When you go to the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, you see this very, very long driveway leading up to his house, and you hear the story of him when he was first diagnosed with polio. He was convinced he was going to beat it, and he would literally, with braces, for exercise, walk himself and say, I'm going to get to the end of that road. And, you know, you just imagine it, you know, the tenacity that takes. So I think there's something to that, too, in each of them.
Let's go up here, and then we'll come over here.
Barry, can I get two questions?
After you tell us who you are.
Okay. I'm Jim Costaris, and my first question's about Vietnam and President Kennedy. I'm of the post-Vietnam generation. I was a young kid during the 60s. I did have two cousins that were drafted. They served in Vietnam. And what I've heard, what I've read, is speculation that President Kennedy would have, had he lived, he would have, he would not have allowed the war to escalate, which of course, ruined Johnson's more progressive agenda. So first question, is that true? What is, I mean, we can only speculate, but is there evidence for that? Second is, about Kennedy and the Peace Corps. I was really excited when I saw the film clips from that famous speech at Michigan. In the 80s, I joined the Peace Corps, and Kennedy's challenge rippled even 25 years later. The urban myth among Peace Corps volunteers was that he didn't have a plan in place on his platform. It wasn't part of his platform. It was a spontaneous idea that just came out of more by happenstance, came out of the moment at Michigan. So, second question is that true, or was there in fact a program he and his staff had in mind that they wanted to implement, which was, what became the Peace Corps? Or was it, just sort of kind of the moment?
So it was spontaneous, the Peace Corps. It was in a conversation with students. There are other strands before the Michigan meeting where you hear that in the speeches he talked about it a little bit. But the story goes, he gets elected and he turns to Sergeant Shriver and he says, I need you to create this thing. And he said, well, what is it? He said, we're going to figure it out. So it was literally quite spontaneous. With respect to Vietnam, historians have debated that question for years and years. He had lived through the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had served in war, which were very different experiences than President Johnson brought to the table. So one doesn't, that's for history to judge, but.
I think maybe we'll have to wait for this new biography, but I think there's pretty good evidence that he had made the decision privately to get out. Because he had done so with Laos, which also was communist controlled, and clearly made a decision that we were not going to be involved there. But we'll have to see. Just an interesting personal story. In '88, I spoke from that very spot to what must have been 10 or 15,000 University of Michigan students, right there in front of that building. I was on time, by the way. I think I was on time. Anyway, but for a guy like me to be on that spot, and there's a stone in the ground commemorating it, it's quite an experience. It really was.
I have to say there's something about Michigan here because, for the record, I was born at the University of Michigan. So, who knew?
I can't claim that, but I'll tell you, there's a part of Detroit, it's called Greektown. It's got a lot of Greek restaurants. And one of them was run by an interesting guy who was quite involved politically. He had come over from Greece when he was 19 and was deeply involved and stuff. And every time we left Detroit after a campaign event, there would be a large box of what he called Greek lollipops, which are these wonderful small lamb chops with a lot of oregano. And I got to tell you, on the campaign trail, you're not eating great. It's chilly and we just waited for that box of Greek lamb chops once we got up in the air and started heading back to Boston for one of those events. Yeah.
Let's go over here. I'm sorry. One more over here. Oh.
Bob Gittins, I'm here at Northeastern as the Vice President of Public Affairs. I think, Barry, you asked people for anecdotes, and one that occurred to me, well, two things occurred to me. One was in the list of significant events. The thing that occurred to me was that we ought to add the assassination of Malcolm X to that list because that continues to resonate to this day. The other thing that occurred to me as a young kid growing up in Dorchester, I had a group of friends, and one day one of those friends was no longer there. And I'd learned subsequently that he was the son of Reverend James Reeb, who was killed in Alabama, if you call, and that brought the civil rights movement home in a very direct way to an 11 or 12-year-old in a way that it hadn't happened before.
Wait for your mic, if you would. No, start again with the mic.
David Geller from Brookline. Just briefly, in a couple of weeks, my dad is being honored on the field at Yankee Stadium for his World War II service. But one of the interesting, he was a B-24 bombardier navigator, flew a whole bunch of missions, and every mission was protected by the Tuskegee Airmen. And we grew up learning that and understanding that, and that was a big part of our understanding of the war. It was amazing to me to realize that we fought the war against the Nazis with a completely segregated armed forces, which Truman then ended. So my question is, we fought the war, the armed forces were segregated, they were desegregated by Truman, and then Kennedy became president 12 years later, and civil rights did not get fully embraced by the Kennedy administration. And is that historically accurate, and if so, why?
So that's true. He had a few other things going on in his administration, including the Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. And no excuse, that's the president. But at the library, we talk about his own act, which was his own profile and courage, I think, of actually sending the National Guard into Ole Miss. That was, remember, it was all states' rights. So this was a huge risk, and the implications of that the impact of that could have been disastrous. And he nevertheless did do that. So yes, I know there's a mixed record with respect to him on civil rights, but, and then he gave an incredible speech from the Oval Office. Who among us would want to have our skin changed? So I think morally, philosophically, politically, he was very much a progressive with respect to civil rights, but he was also trying to juggle a lot of competing interests and trying to move it forward, but when, sort of positively. But when push came to shove, there was a bold move there.
Hi, my name is Derek Schuster. I moved up here 8 years ago from Boca Raton, Florida, to attend Northeastern, actually. And I actually just got my master's from BU in city planning. We only studied you, Professor Bluestone. And as long as Michigan's the theme, I only got into that program because as a non-degree seeking student, I went to Flint, Michigan for a research project during a spring break, actually. And what a spring break in Flint. And you talked about GM and all these companies in the 60s and their largesse and Standard Oil. And one thing I've learned about in my studies is this GM streetcar conspiracy, which on the topic of urban planning, you might be able to talk a bit on. I'd be interested in hearing from you and from Governor Dukakis how you feel federal and any policies related to urban infrastructure and to transportation infrastructure have really affected the last 50 years. Was there any point in the 60s that might be worth keeping note of over the next few months through this course?
A good question. Let's go back a little bit. You mentioned the GM streetcar thing. That actually goes back to the 1920s, where General Motors would basically buy up streetcars, the most famous being in Los Angeles, to try and get people into automobiles. We also have the auto companies working very hard in one city after another to build things like the Jamaica Way. The Jamaica Way was established for passenger automobiles and particularly for Sunday drivers to go out and experience the country. And so we built the Jamaica Way and those kinds of roads. And again, they were supported heavily by the auto industry to move people into their automobiles. The biggest development, of course, in terms of automobile transportation is the 1950s. The passage of the National Defense Highway Act in, I think, 54, which begins the development of course, today's interstate highway system. And that continues and is expanded during the 1960s. What I don't know much about, and I should because we're doing a lot of work on transportation at the Dukakis Center, is the role in the 60s of the federal government and the presidents having to do with public transit and the support of railroads, the support of subway systems and so forth. And I don't know the answer to that.
Let me tell you a
I'll
story.
bet you do.
Well, a little bit. Barry's right. We came out of World War II. I mean, you had to be a kid during World War II. We never saw a new car for 5 years, 6 years. And I remember in Brookline when the first Hudson showed up in the neighborhood, followed by the first Studebaker, the first Nash, the first Kaiser, the first Fraser. Means nothing to any of you.
I know them all.
You know, it was a sort. We gathered around these shiny new cars. Wow, right? And so we began investing as a nation in highways to accommodate this huge demand for relatively inexpensive cars that came out of World War II, and in airports. But public transportation, as we now call it, was all privately owned. The Boston Elevated Street Railway. I bet there's anybody here remember the Boston L? Just a handful. Ran the transit system. They were a licensed, regulated monopoly, but they ran the transit system. And they went bankrupt in 1946 and were taken over by the state because, in fact, all of this public money was going to subsidize highways and airports, and none of it to support public transportation. Well, more and more cars, more and more congestion, and the answer was more and more highways. And so, following the passage of the Interstate Highway Act, every metropolitan area in the country had its master highway plan, and ours was one of them. What was the master highway plan? 6 8-lane expressways coming through 128 into the city. Then, of course, if you did that and nothing else, you'd have a massive traffic jam in downtown Boston. So you had to have an inner belt highway, presumably to circulate that traffic and avoid that traffic jam. And that was the master highway plan for metropolitan Boston, which would have covered this city with asphalt. The Inner Belt Highway was 8 lanes elevated, every bit as ugly as the Central Artery, starting at the Southeast Expressway, coming up what is now Melanie Cass Boulevard, didn't exist at the time, down Ruggles Street, 8 lanes elevated, 3 feet from the Museum of Fine Arts, right through Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace in front of Simmons and Emanuel. You with me? Through Beach Park in Brookline, for those of us who live in Brookline. That gem of a park. I mean, if the highway engineers could find a park, that's where they want to put the highway. Across the Charles River, smashing its way through Cambridge, Central Square, and terminating around on the other side of the Central Artery. And if you go over there, you can still see the stub, which was supposed to connect it. And I looked at this thing, and I said, this is terrible. There weren't many of us. Oh, yeah, special pleaders from the communities that were affected. But after all, this was progress, right? And I began wondering a little bit whether I was kind of out of my gourd. Until JFK, as president, began raising questions about the D.C. Master Highway Plan, which included a highway right down the mall. 8 lanes elevated. I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you. And then the newly elected mayor of San Francisco, in 1963, a labor leader named Jack Shelley, who was in Congress, came back. Just as the so-called Embarcadero Highway was being built, right across San Francisco, right in front of that gorgeous waterfront. Sound familiar? It was their Central Artery. And Shelley said, that's it. We're not building one more foot of the Embarcadero. Federal Highway went nuts. All that money, this, that, and the other thing. And any of you know this know that the Embarcadero Highway hung there, uncompleted, until the good Lord sent an earthquake. Right in the middle of the World Series. You with me? And by that time, or soon thereafter, San Francisco had a Greek-American mayor born in Springfield, named Art Agnos. Went to Bates College. had been a legislator out there. And Agnew said, this is a great time to tear the goddamn thing down. And it was torn down, and it now has a trolley line with vintage trolley cars. And if you wait long enough, one of them, which is bright orange, will come by and it'll say Boston Elevated Street Railway. I made Kitty sit there for 35 minutes. I said, I'm convinced there's going to be a Boston L streetcar. And sure enough, there was. But you have no idea how important to me it was that the President of the United States, a Massachusetts guy, of course, began raising serious questions about that part of the master highway plan for D.C. coming down the mall. And believe me, it had a great impact on me. I was the first elected official to say, this is crazy, we should kill it. And we did, fortunately, don't you think? And then, and I'll close with this, thanks to a sainted man named Thomas P. O'Neill Jr., who represented Cambridge, TIP got an amendment to the federal transportation law permitting states like this one that didn't want any more of that highway money for things like the master highway plan to use it for public transportation. And fortunately, I got elected about that time. We got $3 billion in federal highway money, folks, that we poured into the T for a whole series of things, many of which you're familiar with now. Every one of those projects, just want to throw this in, was on time and on budget. But Jack Kennedy's stepping up and raising questions about what was going on in D.C. as president had a huge influence on yours truly in terms of kind of saying, okay, you know, if the President of the United States is raising questions about this in D.C., then maybe I'm not so crazy after all. Really interesting. But it was all highways and airports, 50s, 60s. I mean, just...
I think, unfortunately, we could go on for hours, days, weeks, months. But we like to try and end on time, and we've gone about 10 minutes over time. But next week, we will continue this with Tom Oliphant, former Washington correspondent of the Boston Globe, who covered Kennedy and covered LBJ, and Fred Longaville, who's writing that definitive text. And I'm hoping that Heather will join us again next week. And we will be looking at JFK and LBJ. Come back, visit, bring your questions. Have a wonderful week. Thanks for coming.